Hey y'all, Dr. Taylor back with you again. This is the last lecture podcast for Module 3 on Chapter 10, the last chapter talking about data gathering and how to measure your variable concepts. And today, Chapter 10 is all about survey research and interviewing. And so what we're going to talk about are, we're going to describe the ways in which survey research and interviewing ensure validity and reliability. We'll discuss the elements of survey research and their importance, identify the costs and benefits of using archive surveys versus conducting your own survey, and explain the role of interviewing and survey research. And so for the specifics of this lecture, we will talk about surveys and then really a lot about questionnaire design. A lot of benefits to using survey research, but of course with any research strategy and any data process, you want to understand the benefits as well as the drawbacks, because nothing is perfect. And whenever you are going to try to use one type of data, you're always going to be making, some sort of deal with the devil about what you're missing. And so you just want to know what that is. So, real fast, this lecture does not, there are going to be a lot of words on the slide each time. And the reason I do this is because there's a lot to say, and I don't want to be constantly clicking through new slides. It's distracting to you, perhaps distracting to me. Excuse me. And so I will just have a lot of information on the slide, and then I'll walk through the information myself, and I'll use the pointer to the mouse as a pointer to highlight things I think are important, which will be highlighted on the video. So here we go. Surveys and Questionnaire Design, Chapter 10, Module 3. So when we think about surveys, we first of all want to really get and be very familiar with the validity and reliability of surveys. Very, very important. And so to avoid these problems, there are several things that the book points out that you want to do. R, of course, is respondent, and I is interviewer. And so what you want to do is make sure that the information, if you want to make sure you have valid and reliable survey responses, this is to say that if you do a survey, you want to know that the information you're getting is both valid and reliable, then you want to make sure that the requested information is available to your respondent. It can't be forgotten or misunderstood. The fact is that surveys can be tricky, and you want to make sure that your information you're trying to get out of your respondents is available to them. You can't be asking them questions about things they don't know. More importantly, the respondent must know what it is to the interviewer a relevant and appropriate response. So they want to know, you have to give them options. This is why surveys often have, they're not open-ended questions. You don't ask people a random question and then just expect to get their answers. That's a type of survey. That's more of an interview style process. But in a survey, you want to give them structured answers, Likert scales, strongly agree to strongly disagree, a lot of survey options. And you want to make sure that both you, the interviewer, and they, the respondent, understand and know what relevant and appropriate responses can be for a given question. Respondents must be motivated to provide the interviewer with information, right? There's conceivably, you can imagine situations where your respondents simply aren't motivated. Maybe you don't have an incentive. Maybe they skip questions. You want your respondents to give you as much information as they can on a relevant question and in a survey. So they got to be motivated. Respondents must know how to provide the information. Again, this goes back to responses. The interviewer must accurately record the responses. If you are not accurately recording the responses of your respondents, then you do not have valid measures. And they certainly won't be reliable either. So that's important. Responses must reflect the respondent's meaning and intentions, not the interviewer's. So whatever the responses that a respondent gives, they must reflect their intentions. When we have survey responses, we have to know that there's no bias introduced by the interviewer. And there are any number of ways you can introduce bias. Interviewer bias is a real problem. And you want to make sure that you mitigate it as much as you possibly can. There are a lot of different things that go into figure 10.1, which is also a part of the discussion for this module. Really shows you the complexities that are taking place when you conceptualize how respondents are responding to an interviewer's questions. It's extremely complex, and there are a lot of psychological things going on, a lot of other, informational, political knowledge things going on. And so, to the extent that we can believe whatever respondents say to a survey interviewer, we need to make sure the responses can reflect the meanings that those respondents want to have. And finally, other users of the data must understand the questions and answer the same way respondents and interviewers do. So if you were to have a freely available data set, or you want to make your data set available to other people, you would want to make sure that anyone using your data set understood the questions the same way you did. Otherwise, you're not going to have valid or reliable measures. So all of these things are ways to ensure that we have validity and reliability in a survey. So if you were to create your own survey, you would want to make sure that you took care of all of these things. Now, a well-constructed survey does all of these things, and many of the surveys we have in American politics, the American National Election Study, the NES, or the General Social Survey, otherwise known as the GSS, they both use very valid, very reliable measures. They're long-running surveys that use really excellent question wording, and they don't have issues. But that's something you have to conceptualize if you want to do your own survey. Survey research is research based on a direct or indirect interview methods. There are several types of surveys. You can do in-person, which include interviews. That's a type of survey. Telephone surveys, which historically are the most common. Mail surveys, they have their own set of issues. Email surveys, which are also problematic. Internet surveys, which are increasingly taking the place of telephone surveys. I want to point out something. This is not, internet surveys are not surveys that you do yourself on Facebook or on a news website or something like that. That's not an internet survey. All right, and so, again, go back to the sampling chapter. How do we make sure we get good samples? You must be randomly sampled. And so if you're doing a survey and there's any bit of self-selection, the survey is not legitimate. So internet surveys are surveys that happen on the internet, obviously, but are done through randomly selecting people from a very, 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 very large, talking about hundreds of thousands of people, millions in some cases, large sampling population that approximate a random sample of the overall population in the United States. And they're becoming increasingly used in political science and other fields, as well as sort of generally available commercial survey outlets like Gallup and Pew and places like that. Internet surveys are becoming increasingly popular because they can approximate even the best telephone surveys. And telephone surveys generally rely on people with landlines, and landlines are increasingly few and far between. So as a result, because you can't really poll cell phones very well, although cell phones are increasingly being put into survey populations, internet surveys are becoming cheaper and more reliable. Group administration, drop-off and pickup are other types of survey methods, but the best, the gold standard is telephone. Increasingly, internet surveys are also useful and legitimate. There are 5 important factors that influence your choice of survey type. Number 1 is the cost. As I said, the reason that internet surveys are becoming preferred compared to telephone surveys is really because of their cost. It's much cheaper to do an internet survey. Completion rates also go up with internet surveys. So cost is good. Completion rates also go up. Telephone surveys are becoming very, very bad for completion rates. And then sample population congruent. This is always an issue with internet surveys. You want to make sure not everybody has the internet. You'd be shocked to know. And we want to make sure that sample populations reflect the general population of interest that we care, for our research questions. So internet surveys at one time were not reflective of the general population. They are increasingly so, and so that's why they become better choices. And then questionnaire length is also important. The longer your survey is, the less likely people are going to be to complete it, so you want your survey to be short. And then data processing issues. If you have surveys that are using novel question wording, where you divide up your sample to do some survey experiment kind of things to see how question wording affects different types of responses, you're going to end up with data processing issues. And so you want to try to use the same question wording that other people have used if possible. The question wording is usually freely available on survey company websites. So Gallup, the survey wording is always available. The National Election Study said the NES is always available. Annenberg is always available. Pew. So you want to avoid data processing issues by making sure that you have good question wording. So the cost, all surveys share basic expenses for materials. The cost of a survey can be quite variable. So, is it professional questionnaire design? What's the length of the questionnaire? Geographic dispersion of sample, callback. So all of these are issues, all of these here. I'm not going to go through them all, but all these are problems associated with cost of a survey. And again, this really goes back to mode of survey response. Are you going to do telephone survey? If so, are you going to allow people to read the questions as you say them off, or are you going to rely on them to read? Internet surveys are good because people can do them on their own time if they complete them all in one sitting, but they can, if people read faster or slower, they can do it at their own pace. It's much better off in general. But the main thing too is that you want to have a trained staff. No matter who's doing your survey, you hope that they have some professional training and expertise, and you want to make sure that if you're conducting the survey, if you're administering the survey, that you have a really excellent protocol for teaching people how to do surveys. Completion rates are always a problem. A low response rate on a survey limits the ability to make statistical inferences about the target population. And so the result then is that we must make an effort to reach those selected for inclusion in the sample to maximize the representativeness of the sample, or you risk bias. And so what happens is, if you have someone who's been selected for a survey and they don't complete the survey, or they won't answer the survey questions, that becomes a real problem for survey interviewers trying to get accurate data. You've been randomly selected into that survey, and telemarketers have really made life very difficult, because for a long time people would answer telephone surveys with no trouble, because of how rare was it that anybody ever call your house. It's exceedingly rare, but if you were selected into a survey, it's really important that you did it because you were randomly selected. And so, by the nature of the math involved in your selection, we wanted to make sure that we had your attitudes as representative of your characteristics. But then telemarketers started picking up on the fact that, hey, people like to be asked their opinion, and so they began to use that as a way to get you to stay on the phone longer. They would act like you were they were a survey interviewer, and they would keep you on the phone to try to sell you a vacation to Bermuda or something. And that ended up making people much less willing and interested in doing surveys. And so as a result, completion rates started going way down. And now, with the nature of the lack of landlines and things like that, it's just a real issue for telephone surveys. So, and if those who fail to participate in the survey share common characteristics, let's say you're asking questions on race and politics, and people who are in minority groups become very uncomfortable with the way you're asking the question. They refuse to answer the question. Well, if you're asking a question about race and politics, and people in target minority groups are uncomfortable answering your questions the way they're being asked, then you're going to bias your results against that population one way or another. And so the sample will be wrought with systemic sampling error, and the conclusions made from data could be wrong. So you want to make sure that your sample and population have some level of congruence. If you're asking questions of people, you want to make sure that the questions are worded in such a way that makes everyone comfortable to answer them truthful and honestly, so that you can make sure to have accurate representations and accurate understanding of your population. With questionnaire length, you want to keep people's attention spans. People are shockingly not interested in hanging out for hours and hours and hours answering questions about surveys, our own surveys. And so you want to keep things pithy and to the point. People lose focus. If you speed through the questions, they may answer wrongly or incorrectly, and sometimes they may want to speed through to answer more quickly, and that could affect the quality of your survey. And survey length ranges from 3 or 4 dozen questions, depending on the complexity and format of the survey itself. Generally, a good survey lasts anywhere from 25 to 40 minutes. Less than that, I don't really know what you're asking about. More than that, it's just too long. And then you need to have incentives that keep people on the phone or working through the online format. So incentives could be things like the opportunity to be in a iPad raffle, or the opportunity to, maybe everybody gets a $10 gift card. You have to have some reason to keep people involved in the survey. So survey data requires a good deal of time and effort. Surveys employing more elaborate or complex designs require time and effort. So this is what I said earlier. So basically, data processing issues, the more complex your survey, the more difficult the data processing is going to be. So in the interest of making sure you can use your data, you generally want to keep your surveys as simple as possible. This is not because you want things to be easy, but because you want to make things as streamlined as you can. And the more complex your survey is, the less likely that is going to be. So here, this is from your book. This is table 10.1, which is on page 302 in my book. So table 10.1 has some really excellent sort of characteristics of surveys. And so here you have the type of survey, right? Personal, face-to-face, telephone, mail, email, overall cost, potential completion rate, characteristics of the sample population congruence, question length, and data processing costs. And this sort of gives you an idea. So if, let's say for instance, you thought you were going to do a survey to answer your research question and test your hypothesis in your research design, you would want to go through and pick one of these types of surveys to choose. Think of how you would want to do the question wording and all that stuff as well. But you'd want to take into account some of these aspects that are here in the matrix to make sure that you're doing the right thing. So if you decide you want to do a telephone survey, I'm going to respond maybe, and you need to account for the fact that you're not going to use an internet survey. Why would you use telephone over internet, or vice versa, given your research question? Justify everything you want to do. You have to justify it. And so if you're doing a case study analysis, why are you doing case studies rather than surveys? If you're doing a survey, why are you doing a survey rather than a case study? And your type of survey, why are you doing an email survey versus a group administration survey, right? So these are the things you have to deal with, right? So we're going over this information so that you'll know the differences. But you also, this is information you can use to justify your choices. You are having to make an executive decision on what to do. Tell me why you're doing it. What is the reason behind your selection? So questionnaire design is extremely important. There's a lot of really excellent information in your chapter about questionnaire design. Figure 10.2 talks about sampling frames and student population. But really, when you think about, once you get past the population and sampling issues, you really want to make sure that your questionnaire is really quite good. And question wording can be important. There's great stuff here. Chapter 10, page 322, 323, 324 are all very, very good at talking about some differences between question wording issues. And so response quality is the extent to which responses provide accurate and complete information. Oh, sorry guys. Quality can be better when the respondent is motivated by a friendly, business-like survey administration style. Interviewers avoid biasing responses through cues, and when your probing is used to elicit better answers, not different answers, but better answers, more in-depth answers, more specific answers. The physical design of a survey can also affect response quality. Good designs will increase the likelihood that a survey will be completed properly. So you want to make sure that your questions are written clearly. You want to make sure they are structured in an informative and thoughtful way. And you want to make sure that you're asking similar questions at similar times while trying to not bias the responses your respondents are giving. But question order can definitely introduce bias. And so when previous questions affect the answers to later questions, or when previous questions affect the likelihood of completing the survey, you're introducing bias. And so sometimes when you ask questions on surveys, you're going to get to tricky areas. All right, you ask questions about race and politics, gender and politics. Actually, if we're just being honest, these days, any questions about politics are going to be very, very tricky for some people to answer, just because it's the nature of polarized politics in America. But when you're asking questions, you don't you want to ask those because we want to know the answers to some of these very important, sticky questions, right? Talking about transgender rights in American politics. Those are important questions we want answered. I personally, me, Ben Taylor, I want to know how people feel about transgender rights in America. If I want to do a survey to find that out, then I have to be very, very thoughtful and extremely careful as to how I structure those questions and order those questions so that I don't bias people for or against transgender rights in America, change their own opinion. I'm not looking to change anybody's mind. I'm looking to get people's actual attitudes. And so these things here, question order can be very important. If I ask a bunch of questions first and then I ask about transgender rights, some people may be offended or some people may feel uncomfortable. And so then they may, because they don't want to say, oh, I'm in favor of transgender rights or oh, I'm against transgender rights, and they may quit the survey. And that would be a problem because then I'd be biasing my results. High quality questions prompt accurate answers, while low quality questions often prompt unreliable and inaccurate answers. So you don't want to use double barrel questions. So double barrel questions are things like, do you agree with the statement that the situation so thinking about the 2003 to 2010 war in Iraq, do you agree with the statement that the situation in Iraq is deteriorating and the United States should increase the number of troops in Iraq? So there are two questions there. You're saying, is Iraq going good or bad? Should we increase or decrease troops? And more to the point, the way that question is worded is structured in a way to emphasize a certain response. So those are double-barrel questions that can be very problematic. Ambiguous terms, you don't want to use jargon. You want to so if you're talking about the Affordable Care Act, you want to say, the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, right? Because it's the two names by which it goes in American politics. Leading questions would be things like, so this is a good one. Don't you think that global warming is a serious environmental problem? It clearly implies that if you do not, then you're wrong, or that it leads you at least to say, yes, it is. And again, this is not to have a normative position one way or the other, but if you honestly want to know people's attitudes on climate change, then, or global warming, which, by the way, those phrases themselves could be sources of bias, right? Because climate change is the more appropriate empirical name, but historically it was called global warming because in general the world's average temperature is increasing, which is going to induce general global climate change. Some places will get colder, some places will get warmer, but in general, places where it used to rain some, it won't. Places where it used to be dry, it might rain. And so it's climate change overall, but the precipitating cause is, of course, an increasing global temperature. So it's a complex phenomenon. And then when you wrap that up with ideology and other things, then it becomes very, very tricky. And so inappropriate technical slang or unusual vocabulary may cause people to react differently to certain types of questions. These are all very, very important, 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 provide answer choices. If you are looking for a more exploratory analysis or you're looking to do more qualitative work, then it's very likely that open-ended questions are the way you want to go. Again, it depends on your research design strategy as to what kinds of questions you want to ask in an interview or survey context. There's no right or wrong answer. There are better or worse choices given your expectations. So closed-ended questions are easy to code and analyze. They allow for self-selection into predetermined categories. Respondents are more likely to answer these questions with respect to sensitive topics. It may force respondents to choose pre-coded answers that do not match their own position, so that could be difficult. And it may include inappropriate choices that lead to a choice of other, or don't know, or some other non-attitude category, which becomes troublesome in data analysis. But open-ended questions, they allow respondents to be able to more fully explain their answers, create the opportunity for researchers to find answer choices they had not anticipated. And these questions are time-consuming and difficult to analyze because answers may be complex, unclear, too long, or too short. But the main thing here, you could read the rest of this, the main thing is that open-ended questions are really good for exploratory and qualitative analysis. Closed-ended questions are really good for well-known areas of research where you're trying to replicate or innovate on certain findings, or you want to make sure that you have a general idea about where people stand on a given issue with a well-known area of politics. Interviewer style is especially important during interviews. If you're going to do interviews, they could be particularly useful when you're studying political elites, and this is another good way to generate deeper research questions. So, and then over time, as you begin to interview, having a good rapport will help facilitate the conversation, because an interview is a conversation. There's a real art to an interview, and it is not something that you just wake up on a Monday and by Wednesday you think to yourself, all right, hot dog, I'm good to go. Probably not. Interviewing takes a lot of time and a lot of practice. So you would definitely want to get some practice interviewing lower level people first before you move up to the higher level interviewees in a given research project, both because you want to refine your research question and your interview questions, but also because you want the practice. All right, so that's survey, research, and interviewing. There's a lot going on in this chapter, so if you have questions or you want to talk more about surveys, do feel free to send me an email. But the chapter is pretty self-explanatory. Provided that your sample is randomly selected, and provided that your questions are worded appropriately, and that question order and question wording aren't affecting the responses that your respondents give you, your survey is probably going to be good to go. There are a lot of surveys available in American politics, so if you want to explore some of those, send me an email, let me know. I can send you a good link to where you can look at survey question wording. Otherwise, keep working on your research design. We are at the end of Chapter 3 with this lecture podcast, so keep it moving. Send me an email if you got any questions or concerns, and Module 4 is on the way.